I want to talk a little bit now about a very important aspect of advanced play, that is to say, defence. Not everybody is a good defender. Virtually all of us would prefer to attack in our games and get the initiative to put the opponent under pressure. But occasionally you are going to have to recognise that you've been outplayed in a game, and to be able to defend yourself is a really important thing. So I'm going to concentrate on my next two tips on, I think, two very important aspects of defence. Now, firstly, to review the basic rule. If you've got a winning position, you don't take any risks. None whatsoever. You just want to stroll to victory in the easiest possible way. So you avoid complications and just try to make things simple for yourself. If you've got a bad position or even a lost position, you can take any risk. You can gamble, you can sacrifice. You have to get counterplay at all costs to distract the opponent from their obvious winning plan. But there is a huge area in the middle of these two ideas where basically you're worse in a position. It's not resignable. It's not a hopeless position by any means, but you are naggingly worse. The opponent's got you under the cosh. What do you do then? And this is where really you see the difference in class between players, because most weak players tend to collapse in a position like this. They can't manage to sustain the defensive qualities needed to hold these slightly worse positions. So I think Jonathan Rowson, it was, in one of his books, The Seven Deadly Chess Sins, talked of the theory of infinite resistance. And it was the Australian Grandmaster Ian Rogers who explained this by saying that basically in any position in chess, there's always a resource if you look for it. So I think what I'd like to suggest to you on this segment is that you've got to get yourself into that frame of mind. Everybody's going to be worse in their games. When you're worse, you must not give in. You've got to condition yourself to look for every last resource. You've got to keep cool, and you've got to take every opportunity available to you. A lot of games I see, even between quite good players, 2200 plus, they're not taking the opportunities available to them in a game of chess. The opportunities, sure, they might be small, but they've got to be taken when they crop up. So remember this theory of infinite resistance and try to incorporate that into your style. Now, to illustrate the idea of how you should play in a very poor position or a poor position, I've got a game from the highest level. This is the game Spassky versus Karpov from their candidates semi-final match back in 1974. You'll remember at that stage in chess history that Spassky had lost to Fischer in 1972. So these two guys were fighting it out for the right to play Korchnoi in the final, and then, well, theoretically, to play Fischer in the World Championship match in 1975. So the stakes were very high. This was game 8 in the match, and the score stood at 2-1 to Karpov. So Spassky with the white pieces simply had to win this game. The opening is a standard Caro-Kann defence, where white plays h4, threatening to nab the black bishop. Black plays h6 to save the bishop. White gains a little bit of space on the king side by playing h5. And we get a main line where white exchanges off the bishops on d3. And black plays his knight out to f6. Karpov was content to play these very solid positions, particularly given his match situation. And it's very difficult for white to break into the black position in this variation of the Caro-Kann. Black's position is inherently solid. He's got these twin pawns in the centre, restraining white's pawns on d4 and c4. And it's an open question, even today, whether this pawn on h5 is restrictive and sets up good endgames for white, or is simply a target for black's pieces. For instance, if black manages to exchange off enough pieces in this position, then white can often find himself looking at a very bad endgame. There are certain games where this pawn on h5 has become very weak. So despite the fact it's a very quiet position, there are certainly germs of the win for both sides. Karpov's fault in the opening in this game is that he plays a little bit too passively. Spassky, meanwhile, is mindful of the match situation and comes in with the aggressive move knight f5. Karpov seeks exchanges with bishop f4. Bishop takes f4, queen takes f4. And you see, white can't really take advantage of that knight on f5 in the sense that he can capture on g7, because after king f8, unfortunately the knight's going going west. Well, of course, white can pretend that he's doing something by taking on e6, black recaptures, and the problem is white can't capture on e6 because of rook e8. Never mind, says Spassky, I've got better chances here. Knight comes to e3, black goes back to queen c7, and white castles on the queen side. b5. Well, when black, this move is positionally very well motivated because black's trying to shift the pawn on c4. Once that pawn goes, and Spassky did take the pawn on b5, then black secures the d5 square for a knight. He's hoping to entrench that knight on d5, and as a result, make his position even more impregnable than it was before. Black takes on b5 check, king b1. The drawback I have, of course, with this idea of b5 is that black can't castle queenside anymore. So he's committed to this move castling on the king side, and now Spassky starts to open things up with the move g4. Knight e4, rook h g1. Still looking very promising for white, so black seeks exchanges with knight g5. But after knight takes g5, h takes g5, Karpov finds himself in a very difficult position. Well, now Spassky, I think, in this position was starting to sense blood. And black has to dig in and recognise that he's got a very difficult game. Spassky in the game played d5, which again looked very promising. Perhaps what he should have done was to take on b5 in this position and just allow black to get a little bit of counterplay here with, for instance, rook b8 and then rook b4. I mean, I can see why Spassky didn't do this. Black is taking advantage of the open lines on the queen side. Nevertheless, after a move like rook c1, queen f4 and only now d5, I think white is starting to build on his advantage. Knight b6 and now d6. Why didn't Spassky do this? Well, I think for two reasons. One, as I say, he didn't want to allow black this counterplay on the queen side. Number two, this is a positional route to victory. I think Spassky, in the position we reached in the game, really wanted to punish Karpov, this gratuitous weakening on the king side. And so he played d5. a6, well, that's a very cool move. Under fire, Karpov just takes a little bit of time out to protect his pawn. And it's scarcely believable that white isn't going to crash through here after the thematic move h6. It all looks very promising for white. But it's around here that Karpov really starts to up his game. He looks hopeless. The position is very difficult for black. It's Boris Spassky, one of the greatest attacking geniuses of all time, attacking you. Well, most players would not save this position. But now Karpov, as I say, starts to dig in and look for every last resource in the position. G takes h6. Well, this move is forced, as it turns out, but how many of us would have played g6 in this position, hoping to block white out? Well, it turns out after g6 that white can take on e6, black recaptures, and now there's a brilliant winning move here, knight to f5. I've no doubt at all that Karpov saw this move, but for a lot of us it will be a very difficult move to see, because the knight places itself on a square where it can simply be taken. Yes, there's no doubt about it here. Unfortunately for black, he loses this position if he takes the knight. The queen comes into e6 check, rook f7, queen takes g6 check, king f8, and now the pawn marches on to h7. I mean, this is just fairly awful. Going back to the position after knight f5, well, g takes f5 isn't much better either. So perhaps if black wants to try and defend himself independently, he can try a move like rook a e8. Then comes the nice line clearance, sacrifice h7. The king probably's got to take that. Rook takes d7 check. Lovely move. Queen takes d7. Rook h1 check. King g8, and now the coup de grace. Queen e5, and that finishes black off. There are just too many threats for black to negotiate. So, going back to the game, Karpov had plenty to think about. And again, as I say, he really dug in here and started to find only moves. Well, rook h1 is the logical follow-up to g takes h6, and really this position looks hopeless for black. The opening of the h-file seems to lead to carnage, and rook takes h6 is threatened with the obvious idea of just piling in with the queen and rooks. Now again, Karpov finds a brilliant move here, knight f6, and I'm sure Spassky overlooked this move. This is a resource which most players just would not find, allowing white to take on h6. It looks completely forced here to play king g7. I mean, that seems to be completely forced. But the problem is with that move, f4. This move clears open lines for the white queen to enter the fray. If black takes with a pawn in this position, white has queen h2. And if rook h8, white plays the excellent move knight g2. Again, that's not an easy move to see because it's a retreating move. Of course, the point is just to take back the pawn on f4 and then introduce the knight into the attack. So if black plays e5 in this position, again, I think knight h4, and the knight decisively joins the attack here. Going back to the position after f4, this is complex stuff. Obviously, black could take back with the queen. Again, this is opening up lines for the white pieces. Yeah, it's very, very difficult for black after, for instance, d takes e6. Then we go queen e4 check, king a1, queen takes e6, and then knight f5 check. Again, decides matters. Finally, just going back to the position once more after f4, if only now black plays knight f6, then we go d takes e6, f takes e6, and white smashes through with f5. This time white's getting all the squares again around the black king without even having to invest any material to do so. So black's position, I hope that summary of variations gave you the idea that black's position isn't that easy, and how good Karpov's defence is here after knight f6. Well, obviously white now plays rook takes h6. King comes to g7. And now you see the point of this is that if white plays rook dh1 in the game, black can force off the pieces by playing rook h8. White hasn't had the time to introduce his queen into the game, and therefore has to submit to exchanges, which is of course what he doesn't want. So going back, Spassky beat the retreat with rook h1. And now comes an excellent and very cool centralising move here, rook a d8, inviting white to take on e6. Knight comes back to c2. And once again, it really does look as though black is under pressure here. White's threatening queen takes e6. He's also threatening a very good move here, knight d4, when knight takes e6 would perhaps be the most crushing move of all in this position. But for the final time in this game, black finds a really good defensive resource. He puts his queen in on f4. And the point of this is to play queen e4 at the right moment and force off the queens. Very good. f3, cutting Spassky out from e4. The very cold-blooded king f7. White plays a3. Well, he can't play knight d4 because the rook and the queen are covering that square. The knight on f6 is doing a sterling job covering h7. e5. When you've got weaknesses, you get rid of them. So Karpov's very much thinking of playing e4, and that's exactly what he played in the game. F takes e4 by Spassky. Rook takes d1 check, forcing off some pieces. And now, just when you were expecting queen takes e4, check. Another excellent move here, rook e8, and the defence with this move is successfully completed. Now, just going back, black could have rather hastily here taken on g4. I mean, that's one way where he could claim he was playing for the win. I think the queens will come off here. The rook will come to f1 check, king g7, driving the king to the g file, and now rook g1. After this sequence of moves, white could subject black to quite unpleasant pressure. He's winning a pawn in this position, I think, or at least he's putting him under serious pressure on the queen side, because the knight's probably going to have to be able to take on a6 in a minute after rook f4. So, rook e8 in the game, completes coordination, completes the defensive masterpiece, and now we get some liquidations. Knight takes a6, off come the queens, knight c7. That was a worry for black in the other line, where, if you remember, the knight was on g4. Pawn comes to b4. Off come another set of pawns. Rook f1. Rook f4. And in this position, the two agreed to a draw. Rook f4, of course, is yet another good move. And, well, either creates a passed pawn by force, or black is going to take back on g4 at his convenience. So a brilliant defensive performance by Karpov, and let's not forget who was playing white. You know, he was under pressure from one of the strongest grandmasters of all time. He showed the necessary coolness in defence to hold a really difficult position. So just remember, to summarise, the theory of infinite resistance. You've got to toughen yourself up. Occasionally in chess, you're going to be required to defend slightly worse or maybe worse positions that are not hopeless. You don't have to go onto crazy mode, sacrificing stuff, taking risks. You just have to tough it out. Look for every last resource in the position. Condition yourself to do that, and you will become a much stronger